I know people have told me never to meet your heroes, and that can be true in a lot of instances, but not in this case. I know that Anne Blythe passed away yesterday, and like the world, I'm mourning with it and trying to get my feelings down and just trying to get my thoughts together. I had the very honorable pleasure of knowing Anne Blythe very briefly and getting to interview her and then having several conversations with her. That was really, really, really special. And I kind of wanted to talk about that today. I know a lot of people are talking about the movies that she was in and Mildred Pierce, and that's what she was known for. But I want to talk about the person behind that. When I was 7 years old, I started watching Anne Blythe, and the very first movie I watched was called Our Very Own, which dealt with the subject of adoption, which I loved because I'm adopted anyway. And then I saw her in Chip Off the Old Block, which I loved too, because I loved Donald O'Connor and I loved Peggy Ryan, both of whom she remained friends with for her entire life up until their untimely passings. And then, of course, I watched her in Mildred Pierce and thought, my God, where is this woman's Oscar for this? She was fabulous, and she was absolutely devastatingly terrible. But that was what her character called for. In 2019, I was on an assignment for my alma mater to try to interview as many old living legends as possible in old Hollywood. So I thought of myself, who would be great for this? Jane Powell, Jane Withers, Anne Blythe, Horace D. Collins, as well as maybe Anne Margaret. Thought about this. The task was pretty huge. So I got in touch with the very first living legend that I got and was able to get, Anne Blythe. I cold called her house in 2019 and I said, hey, I'm Kate and this is the assignment I have to do. Do you mind if you want to do it? And she was so delightful and said, of course, absolutely. Unfortunately, right now, it is the holiday season and I'm going to be out of town for quite a while. And I said, of course, not a problem. And I said, I can call back whenever you have the time. And she said, well, when is this assignment due? I said, well, I have to have it in by February. And she said, let's do January. She didn't exactly give me a time or a date at the time, but I said, let's do it. And then we started playing phone tag in January. She calling me, I missing the call, me calling her back, her missing my call. And then finally, we got a match. And we talked to each other and we set up a date. On January 20th, 2020, right before the pandemic hit, we got to have our very first conversation. I was really nervous, and she could tell that. And she said, I actually still have the interview. I have the audio, and you could hear her say, it's okay, you're doing great. I asked her about her career, I asked her about certain people, and then I told her that we had a friend in common, Gloria Jean, who she was really happy to hear that we were both friends too. We talked about Peggy Ryan, Donald O'Connor, of course, Joan Crawford, and other things that she did. I asked her about her family, and I said, how many kids do you have? I always am very excited to know about like the living legends and if they have relatives. It just makes me excited to know that there's a lineage there. She said she had 5 kids, 10 grandkids, and 4 great-grandkids. I was stunned. Couldn't believe it. I talked to her again a little bit later, and I told her that the article was almost ready. It was edited, and I hoped that she was going to like it. She said, terrific. And then she asked me a personal question. She said, can I ask you a personal question, Katie? And I said, yes, ma'am, absolutely. She said, how did you find my films? And why do you love them so much? And I knew that I needed to tell her. So for those of you who don't know, I'm autistic. And that sometimes is hard to explain to people. But I told her, I said, Miss Blythe, if I may. She says, yes. I said, I'm on the spectrum. I'm autistic. And sometimes the world does not make sense, but it makes sense with you. And she said, talk to me about that. I may not understand. And I said, sure. So I said, sometimes I may not understand people and I may not understand the world, but when I watch your films, you get to play different people and you get to be different people. And you don't have to be you. I said, does that make sense? And she said, I understand completely. And she said, so I guess with you being on the spectrum, you like our movies or my films because it helps you try to be other people. And I said, yes, it's called masking. So I explained to her what masking was, and she was very interested in it. But she was very sweet, and she was very kind. And she said, I'm very happy to have helped you branch out and live life. We talked a few more times up until 2021. And then she told me life was going to get busy for her. But she said she did appreciate our conversations, and I will always appreciate that. I told her that in 2014 I had received 2 autographs from her. And she said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I told them that they were very, very special to me, and they still are. I think the most important thing about Anne is that we always look at our heroes and we see how wonderful they are. And I know that when my granny gave her to me when I was 7 years old, she was giving me a wonderful person. So to her family, who I hope to share this video with, I want you to know that I'm with you in your grieving and your mourning, because she was wonderful and she was always beautiful, and I'm going to miss her. But I know that when I look at the autograph that I have now framed on my desk, I know that she'll always be with me forever. So I love you, Anne, and thanks for everything, and rest well.